There comes a moment in a woman's life when disrespect, something that once pierced her like a blade, no longer has the power to shatter her. It lands, it stings, but it does not break her apart the way it once did. This shift is not numbness, nor is it denial. It is the quiet, steady awakening of someone who has learned to hold her center, even as the world around her forgets her worth. What unfolds from this awakening forms the foundation of a deeper journey, one that Carl Jung spent his career mapping, a journey where true transformation occurs not through reaction, but through consciousness. And once a woman steps into this deeper territory, everything about the way she navigates conflict, relationships, boundaries, and her own inner landscape begins to change. Imagine a moment when someone speaks to you in a way that once would have sent you spiraling. Maybe you would have defended yourself, over-explained, collapsed, or tried to make the other person understand the pain they caused. But now, something different happens. You feel the sting, acknowledge it, and then you watch it pass through you like weather moving across an open sky. There is no suppression and no explosion, only awareness. Jung called this the development of consciousness, the ability to witness your internal experience without becoming fully identified with it. For spiritually mature women, this becomes the first doorway to power. They do not pretend disrespect does not hurt, and they do not force themselves into premature forgiveness. Instead, they practice something Jung would describe as conscious suffering. They allow the pain to exist without letting it redefine their worth. In this distinction lies the beginning of liberation. Feeling disrespected is an emotional event. Becoming the disrespect is an identity. A woman who understands this difference has already stepped beyond the reactive patterns that once governed her life. She can acknowledge her feelings without allowing them to hijack her sense of self. This is emotional sovereignty, the kind of inner strength that grows roots deep enough to withstand storms. Most of us have been conditioned to override our natural protective responses. From childhood, many women learn to stay pleasant, stay accommodating, stay quiet, stay small. But the spiritually mature woman learns to reclaim her instinctive wisdom. When disrespect appears, she responds the way the body automatically pulls away from a burning surface, not out of fear or insecurity, but out of an inherent understanding that her well-being matters. Jung referred to this as integration, the process of honoring all parts of the self without letting any part dominate the whole. The woman who has begun integrating her inner world no longer abandons herself to preserve someone else's comfort. As this inner awareness deepens, she starts noticing patterns, not just in how others behave, but in what inside her becomes activated. Jung believed that every emotional trigger points to an unhealed wound or an unconscious story. And while other people remain responsible for their disrespect, the spiritually evolved woman takes responsibility for her own healing. Instead of centering the offender, she turns inward and asks what ancient pain has been awakened. Is it the ache of not being heard? The wound of being dismissed? The long-standing fear of not being enough? These moments become invitations into deeper self-understanding rather than battlegrounds where she fights for validation. This inward gaze is not self-blame. It is self-liberation. The woman who explores her triggers gains the freedom to choose her responses rather than being pulled into old patterns. In this way, every encounter with disrespect becomes a kind of mirror, reflecting back both the shadow of the one who delivered the insult and the hidden places where she herself longs to be healed. Jung famously said that what remains unconscious will rule our lives, and we will call it fate. By making the unconscious conscious, she breaks the cycle. Over time, this awareness transforms her behavior in subtle but powerful ways. She stops feeling the need to explain herself endlessly. She stops trying to convince people of her worth. She stops exhausting herself in attempts to be understood by those who lack the capacity to see her. Jung wrote extensively about psychological types, the idea that people perceive and process the world differently. Some simply cannot recognize certain qualities, no matter how brightly they shine in front of them. When a woman finally accepts this truth, she is freed from the exhausting labor of persuasion. Instead of fighting for acknowledgement, she begins to embody her value quietly and steadily. Her worth becomes something she inhabits rather than something she performs, and with this shift, her presence begins to speak louder than any argument she could make. As a woman deepens into this new way of being, her relationship to conflict begins to shift. She no longer approaches disrespect as a battlefield where she must win, nor as a test she must endure silently. Instead, she sees it as information about who someone is, about what they value, and about how consciously they move through the world. This clarity allows her to conserve her energy in ways that once felt impossible. She recognizes that explaining herself to someone who is not listening is a form of self-betrayal. She understands now that some people are not refusing to see her. They are simply incapable of seeing beyond their own projections. This realization marks the beginning of a new kind of power, one that grows not from force but from discernment. Instead of trying to correct or educate every person who misjudges her, she begins to observe. She notices the tone of someone's voice, the dismissive gesture, the subtle sarcasm, meant to undermine rather than uplift. But rather than internalizing these signals, she lets them inform her choices. Disrespect becomes a lens, not a verdict. It reveals who is aligned with her truth and who is not. And rather than engaging in exhausting explanations, she simply adjusts her presence. Jung spoke of the transcendent function, the ability to hold two opposites without collapsing into either one. A woman who practices this understands she can acknowledge the hurt someone has caused while simultaneously holding compassion for their limitations. She can recognize the disrespect as unacceptable without needing to degrade the person who delivered it. In this way, she moves beyond the black and white reactions of anger or withdrawal and enters a space where clarity and dignity coexist. This balance becomes even more apparent in how she expresses boundaries. She learns, often through painful trial, that boundaries spoken from desperation rarely hold, but boundaries embodied from self-worth require no justification. Jung emphasized that our presence communicates more than our words ever can. A woman anchored in her value carries herself differently. Her silence feels intentional, not passive. Her withdrawal feels like discernment, not avoidance. Her no becomes a statement of alignment rather than aggression. In the past, she might have tried to maintain connection at any cost, explaining herself repeatedly or overextending her emotional labor to prevent conflict. Now she recognizes that peace purchased through self-abandonment is not peace at all. She learns to trust the wisdom of her own body, how her chest tightens around people who drain her, how her breath shortens when she is not being respected, how her energy shifts subtly yet unmistakably in the presence of someone who cannot meet her with sincerity. These bodily sensations become guidance, not inconveniences to be overridden. Jung believed that the psyche and the body were inseparable, and so she begins to treat her physical responses not as weaknesses but as signals of truth. Her behavior changes accordingly. She no longer stays in conversations where her words are twisted. She no longer remains emotionally available to people who take her presence for granted. She does not announce these shifts dramatically. She simply moves differently. She becomes selective with her availability, deliberate with her yes, and discerning with her attention. Those who are used to unlimited access may interpret this as coldness, but in reality, it is integrity. Over time, she also comes to understand that not every relationship is meant to survive her growth. Some people prefer her smaller, more accommodating self, the version of her who apologized unnecessarily, who tolerated subtle insults, who carried the emotional weight of others without complaint. When she stops performing these roles, those relationships naturally begin to fall away. And while this falling away may feel painful, it is also liberating. Jung wrote that individuation, the process of becoming one's true self, requires the courage to disappoint others. The spiritually evolved woman learns that she cannot become who she was meant to be while remaining tied to those who benefit from her silence. This shift in her relational world begins to reflect the shift within her. She no longer chases understanding. She no longer clings to connections that erode her spirit. She allows what is incompatible with her growth to dissolve. As she does, she starts attracting relationships that mirror her new inner reality, people who respect her boundaries intuitively, who listen without defensiveness, who speak with clarity and kindness, who recognize her value without needing to be convinced. Yet perhaps the most significant change occurs in her emotional landscape. She begins to view every moment of disrespect not as an assault on her identity, but as an invitation into deeper awareness. Instead of spiraling into self-doubt, she becomes curious. Instead of reacting impulsively, she pauses. This pause becomes a sacred space, one where she chooses consciousness over compulsion, presence over reaction, truth over fear. This growing capacity to pause, to feel without collapsing, to observe without internalizing, gradually reshapes her entire relationship with pain. What once felt like a threat to her identity now becomes a teacher. Jung believed that suffering, when approached consciously, transforms into wisdom. And so the spiritually mature woman begins to meet disrespect as material for alchemy. She understands that every emotional ache points to a deeper question: what part of me is still asking for healing? Rather than reacting from the wound, she starts responding from awareness. When someone dismisses her ideas or speaks to her with condescension, she no longer rushes to defend herself or prove her worth. Instead, she notices the old narratives that begin to rise, the whisper that suggests she isn't smart enough, the echo of childhood memories where her voice was overlooked, the familiar contraction in her chest that signals an inherited pattern of shrinking. She recognizes these impulses for what they are, remnants of stories she has outgrown. This recognition allows her to choose differently. She can still feel the discomfort, but she no longer confuses it with truth. This shift alters how she communicates. Instead of reacting with anger or silence, she responds from steadiness. Sometimes she speaks directly, not to attack but to name what occurred. Other times she simply removes herself from the interaction, trusting the quiet clarity of her withdrawal. Her actions become less about controlling how others see her, and more about honoring the truth of her own experience. This is the essence of psychological maturity, the ability to act from one's center rather than one's wounds. Jung often emphasized that the unconscious drives much of human behavior. Most people react not to the present moment, but to unresolved histories projected onto the present. The evolved woman begins to see this with increasing clarity. When someone disrespects her, she recognizes that their behavior is shaped by their own shadows, insecurities, fears, unhealed wounds they are unwilling or unable to confront. Understanding this doesn't excuse their behavior, but it prevents her from personalizing it. She stops absorbing what was never hers to carry. This understanding gives her an unexpected freedom. She no longer feels compelled to correct every injustice directed toward her. She no longer seeks validation from those who cannot offer it. She no longer internalizes the moods, projections, or opinions of others. The more she practices this inner separation, the more she develops what Jung might call psychological immunity. She becomes far less affected by external turbulence because her inner world is no longer tethered to it. Over time, she notices that her resilience is no longer dependent on avoidance or suppression. It emerges from a grounded presence that allows her to stay open without being overwhelmed. She becomes like a tree that has weathered many storms, its roots deep, its branches flexible, its trunk steady. The winds of disrespect may shake her, but they do not uproot her. Instead, they strengthen her capacity to remain whole in the midst of human imperfection. With this strengthened presence comes a profound reduction in reactivity. The average person, when disrespected, may lash out impulsively or collapse into hurt, a cycle of reaction that gives away power. The spiritually evolved woman interrupts this cycle by creating space between the stimulus and the response. Within that space, she asks herself the questions that protect her from unconscious reaction. What am I feeling? What is this urging me to do? What part of me is being activated? And most importantly, what response honors my truth rather than my fear? This kind of introspection allows her to remain anchored even when emotions run high. She does not suppress her feelings. She allows them to rise and pass through without needing to explode outward or implode inward. From this grounded place, her responses become intentional. She might choose to address the issue with clarity. She might choose to disengage. She might choose to redefine the relationship altogether. Whatever path she chooses it consciously. Her inner authority grows quietly but unmistakably. People begin to sense it even before she speaks. There is a calmness about her, a steadiness, a self-possession that cannot be fabricated. This presence does more than command respect. It becomes a filter. Those who operate from genuine integrity are drawn to her. Those who rely on manipulation, defensiveness, or power games find themselves unsettled in her presence and often fall away. She no longer forces alignment. She allows resonance to guide her connections. Through this ongoing process, she discovers something she once believed was impossible: the ability to remain open-hearted without being unguarded, compassionate without being exploited, and emotionally available without sacrificing her well-being. This is the fruit of her inner work, the realization that true strength is not hardness but clarity, not resistance but wisdom, not domination but sovereignty. As she deepens into this sovereignty, the woman who once felt obligated to justify her boundaries begins to realize she no longer needs to explain her decisions to anyone who has already shown they do not value her. This realization does not harden her, it clarifies her. Jung taught that individuation, the slow, courageous unfolding of the true self, often requires us to withdraw from situations that no longer support our growth. The spiritually mature woman learns to withdraw not from fear, but from wisdom. She recognizes that a boundary is not a wall but a doorway, a way of choosing where her energy may enter and where it may not. In practice, this withdrawal often appears subtle. She participates less in conversations where her voice is dismissed. She stops initiating contact with people who only reach for her when they need something. She no longer offers explanations to those who have already made up their minds about her. These shifts are rarely dramatic or confrontational. Instead, they are quiet corrections in the alignment of her life. She is no longer willing to stand in spaces that shrink her. But this withdrawal is not about exile, it is about returning home to herself. With every step back from environments that diminish her, she steps more fully into environments where her presence is honored. She begins to understand that her energy is not an infinite resource, it is a sacred one, and she becomes increasingly selective about where it flows. At this stage, something remarkable happens. She stops trying to rescue relationships that depend on her silence. She stops negotiating with disrespect. She stops begging to be seen. Instead, she lets clarity guide her, and clarity often requires letting go. Jung wrote that the most painful part of growth is the loss of illusions about who people are, about what they are capable of, and about who we believed we needed to be in order to be loved. As these illusions fall away, she makes space for truth to enter. Some relationships grow stronger in the light of this truth, others fade. Either way, she remains faithful to her own becoming. What truly transforms her, however, is her shifting relationship with pain itself. Disrespect no longer feels like a weapon aimed at her identity. Instead, it becomes information, sometimes poignant, sometimes instructive, but always meaningful. She can now differentiate between the sting of someone's unkindness and the whisper of her own intuition. She can sense the difference between a wound reopening and a truth revealing itself. This discernment softens the emotional charge that once overwhelmed her. She realizes she does not need to harden to protect herself. She only needs to stay conscious. In this consciousness, she finds a new kind of peace. Not the fabricated peace of appeasement, nor the brittle peace of emotional shutdown, but a genuine peace rooted in self-trust. She trusts her perceptions. She trusts her instincts. She trusts the intelligence of her inner world. Even when feelings arise that are uncomfortable or inconvenient, she no longer turns against herself. Instead, she listens. She allows her intuition to inform her decisions in ways that logic alone cannot. This growing inner trust spills outward into her relationships. She no longer fears losing people who cannot respect her because she no longer fears losing herself. She no longer clings to connections that require her to diminish her truth. She no longer molds herself into shapes that make others comfortable. She is learning to stand as she is, without apology. Others feel this shift long before they understand it. Some respond with admiration, sensing her authenticity and feeling permission to rise to the same level of integrity. Others react with discomfort, threatened by a woman who cannot be controlled by guilt, flattery, or fear. This discomfort reveals more about them than it does about her. And she has learned not to intervene in another's discomfort, especially when it is a consequence of her choosing herself. Through this process, she becomes something rare, a woman who cannot be manipulated by disrespect because she has nothing to prove. She no longer seeks approval as a currency. She no longer believes that love must be earned through self-abandonment. She no longer defines her worth through someone else's recognition. Instead, her worth radiates from within, steady and unmistakable, becoming a compass that guides her choices. This radiant self-respect begins to reshape the world around her. Relationships deepen because they are chosen, not clung to. Conflicts resolve more easily because she approaches them from grounded presence rather than fear. Opportunities align with her values because she no longer compromises her voice. Life itself begins to reorganize around her clarity. And for the first time, she feels that the steadiness she sought from the world has begun to root itself inside her. As she stands more firmly in herself, she discovers a freedom she once believed belonged only to other people. It is the freedom of no longer needing to win, no longer needing to be right, no longer needing to convince anyone of her worth. Jung wrote that the ego's desire for recognition is one of its most persistent traps, and transcending this desire is one of the greatest spiritual liberations. When a woman finally reaches this point, she realizes that respect is not something she must chase. It is something she emits. It is woven into her tone, her posture, her decisions, the way she occupies her own life. She no longer seeks validation because her sense of identity no longer depends on how others see her. She has located her worth in a place that cannot be touched by human opinion. This does not mean she becomes indifferent. Rather, she becomes anchored. When someone treats her poorly, she can acknowledge it without collapsing. When a relationship starts to reveal its fractures, she can see those fractures clearly without rushing to repair what is not hers to fix. When a connection grows distant, she does not cling out of fear, but allows it to fade if that is its natural course. This is not coldness, it is truthfulness. It is the quiet confidence of someone who understands that losing what diminishes her is not a loss at all. With this newfound clarity, she stops moving through life with the urgency of trying to prove something. Her actions no longer arise from insecurity or longing. Instead, they arise from inner alignment. She chooses where to invest her time and energy with care. She speaks only when speaking honors her truth. She walks away only when staying would betray it. Jung believed that when a person integrates the many parts of their psyche, shadow, persona, unconscious drives, and conscious awareness, they begin to live from what he called the self, the deep center of authenticity. The evolved woman begins to move from this place naturally, almost effortlessly. People notice the difference even if they cannot articulate it. Interacting with her feels different. There is no hidden plea running beneath her words, no subtle attempt to earn worthiness, no trace of shrinking to accommodate someone else's comfort. Her presence is clean, and because she no longer tolerates disrespect, the world around her reorganizes. Those unable to meet her at this level of consciousness drift away, while those who resonate with truth, depth, and mutual respect find their way toward her. Her life becomes less crowded, but more meaningful. The irony is that the more she stops fighting to be understood, the more deeply she is understood by those who matter. The more she stops chasing respect, the more others offer it freely. The more she withdraws from people who drain her, the more space she creates for people who uplift her. This is the natural equilibrium she once tried to force. Now it emerges on its own. Yet the most profound transformation remains internal. She finds herself no longer moved by the same storms that once consumed her. Disrespect may still arrive at her doorstep. It is, after all, part of the human condition, but it no longer destabilizes her. Instead, she experiences it as a moment of recognition, a reminder of her values, a mirror reflecting someone else's inner world, a signpost that guides her choices. What once felt personal now feels symbolic. What once felt threatening now feels clarifying. And because she is no longer reactive, she becomes capable of a deeper compassion. Not the compassion that excuses harm, but the compassion that sees truth clearly. She can understand the woundedness behind another person's sharp words without accepting those words as her reality. She can hold empathy without absorbing responsibility. She can love others without abandoning herself. This is compassion rooted in boundaries, empathy rooted in wisdom. By embracing this way of being, she unknowingly becomes a teacher through presence rather than instruction. Others witness her steadiness and begin questioning their own patterns. A friend watching her refuse to explain herself learns that boundaries can be quiet. A daughter observing her withdraw from disrespect learns she does not need to tolerate cruelty to maintain connection. A colleague noticing her calm response to provocation recognizes that power does not always look like dominance, it can look like stillness. This is how consciousness spreads, slowly, quietly, through the embodied example of someone who has learned to hold herself with dignity in a world that often forgets how to honor it. And so the woman who once felt broken by disrespect now moves through life with a grounded presence that cannot be shaken. She has learned that the storms were never meant to destroy her, they were meant to root her deeper. Each moment of pain became a teacher. Each withdrawal became an act of self-respect. Each boundary became a declaration of truth. In learning to dance with disrespect, she discovered not how to avoid pain, but how to grow through it. She learned that strength does not come from hardening, but from awakening, and awakening, once begun, cannot be undone. If this journey resonated with you, I invite you to reflect in the comments. How have your experiences with disrespect shaped your own becoming? If this message supported your growth, consider liking this video, sharing it with someone who may need it, and subscribing for more deep, reflective explorations. Your presence here helps us build a community rooted in consciousness, compassion, and inner strength.